Hi, folks. Welcome to this wonderful impromptu interview that I'm going to be doing with Andy Ngo and Peter Boghossian, two Portland exiles. So I suppose we'll be talking about Portland. Right, so just as a quick thing, are you both Portland born and bred, are you?
I'm not.
I am.
You are.
I
Okay.
am.
No, I moved there in 99.
Right, so but you've been there for a long time.
Yeah, and it was a fantastic city. It was a very livable, clean, safe, wonderful city.
I mean, when I visited in 2017,
Yeah.
it was a clean, safe,
Yeah.
very
and
middle
you
class.
lived with me.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It was a wonderful place.
Yeah.
And I was very impressed. And so, to be honest, there was a part of me that was like, I'm not surprised these guys have got quite far left, eccentric luxury beliefs. But man, it seems that it really has gone downhill in the last couple of years.
Yes, that stems a lot from the riots of 2020 that really brought in a whole number of like consequences way beyond the riots. 'Cause the riots they ended in after like 7 months.
I mean, that's a long time.
It is very long.
'Cause it was like 100 straight days of rioting, wasn't it?
120 straight days, and then it became about twice weekly, then once a week, then monthly, until it trailed off.
Literally like a festival.
Yeah, but it was
wasn't
deadly.
just the riots. I would argue that it was the response to the riots.
Yeah.
I would say that's more accurate.
Okay,
yes.
tell us about the response, because I assume it was just generally permissive.
Well, let me rephrase. It wasn't just about the riots. It was about the lack of response to the riots.
Yeah, so I was there undercover at that time. I was gathering observations for my book, Unmasked, which I've talked about on your show in 2021. The response, though, from the local government was to completely enable and to legitimize those actions. The long consequences, there are a few, I would say. One, it helped normalize a culture of just criminality in public.
Exactly.
And then on top of that, you had many police officers who resigned or transferred to other agencies because Portland became such a hostile place for police. So even when after the whole defund the police thing happened and then they were refunded, the damage was already done. The money is there, but law enforcement recruits are not willing to apply in Portland for many reasons. And so with that, you have really excessive wait times for emergency 911 phone calls. And short, basically, of a life or death situation, you are really not going to get a police response. So all the things around robberies, thefts, street violence, you're not going to get a police response. And with that, and just a permissive environment politically for lawlessness, and we had an explosion of homeless encampments, which ebbs and flows. But from 2020 till now, I think it's probably the worst it's ever been in Portland.
I think in the last 8 months or so, it's not been as bad. The city is, along with some rich donors, have started initiatives to clean up the city. I've often wondered, so the mayor is unbelievably unpopular, and
Yes.
the mayor, a woman named Sarah Irioni, do you remember her? Yeah, I believe she put ABD PhD in her. All but dissertation does not make you have a PhD.
Sarah Inaroni was a communist woman who ran against Ted Wheeler in 2020.
She's the one
Yes.
who wore the Maoist skirt.
You remember that?
I do,
Exactly.
Yes, that's
Yeah.
correct. That's correct.
Portland, for me, is something of a fascinating case study. Because I remember very clearly in 2017, 2018, when Ted Wheeler was trying to court Antifa.
He, him.
Yeah, him. He was trying to speak at their rallies, and they ended up booing him out, shaming him out, and then setting his apartment on fire.
Yeah, his apartment in the Pearl District, and the consequence of that is he went to his $1 million home in the Northwest, right?
We don't know where he is now, but he left
Once they set the lobby of his building on fire.
Yeah.
Right. So there is something.
It was Antifa who did that, by the way.
Yeah,
not the
there's
far
something
right.
very symbolic in that, right?
Yeah.
Like here's a.
The left-wing facilitator of the communist revolutionaries tries to ingratiate himself with the communist revolutionaries and then gets violently chased out of his own city. There's something very symbolic about
and
this.
I think that the larger lesson here, I think the mistake is that many either on the left or people who would self-describe them as centrist believe that there can be some kind of appeasement and then a rapprochement with people when the fact they already hate you, there is no appeasement. But the other thing that's operative there is that he's rich and he comes from a very wealthy family and he can just move, unlike most middle-class people and virtually all, if not all, people from the lower classes. They just don't have that opportunity. So if someone set their building on fire, they're just out of luck. They have to go to a shelter.
Did Portland get an autonomous zone?
Yes, it did. So,
Excuse me.
so
I know Seattle did. I couldn't remember if
Yes.
Portland did. Right.
there was one in the summer of 2020 in Seattle, the infamous Chaz, Capitol
yeah.
Hill Autonomous Zone. Then by December of 2020, the Antifa in Portland tried to create their own autonomous zone modeled after Chaz. It was much smaller. They called it RHAZ, R-H-A-Z, Red House Autonomous Zone. It was centered around this house in North Portland. They had booby traps set up. The whole road was just blocked off, the whole street. It went on for a few weeks, and the city just, like during the riots, just allowed it to go on, and then it eventually fizzled out because of, infighting and issues that always happen with these far left groups.
Was anyone murdered in it, like in the Chaz?
No.
I don't think so. There were rumors of unreported rapes and assaults, but I don't think anybody was murdered.
Nobody was killed at the Portland Autonomous Zone. It's too small.
Right. Okay. And so the local government was just totally permissive of all this, right?
It was, but maybe the confusion about the murder comes from the fact that there was a murder during the summer of 2020 in Portland. Yeah. That was the murder of a Trump supporter by a self-described 100% Antifa. Those were his words on his manifesto.
Yeah. He was shot.
He shot the Trump supporter in downtown Portland during one of the Antifa riots, then fled out of state to Washington State, close to Olympia.
So this is the guy who got a favorable interview with Vice magazine.
That's right, when he was on the run.
Yes.
And nobody knew who he was. Yeah. He gave, journalists at Vice knew where this fugitive was. Yeah. He died in a shootout with police. And I wrote about this in my book, but there were multiple instances where he had been actually arrested by law enforcement in the state of Oregon and was just let out, including at one of the riots a number of weeks before he went on to murder somebody. He illegally had a firearm, right. And he was just let out. I mean, this was the big issues. Riots were happening every night. Hundreds of people were being arrested every week, and the cases were just dismissed or dropped. This is a matter of policy by the prosecution.
This is very, very important. So my whole life, I've just assumed that everybody's just going to do the job and their system's going to plug along, right? Sure. The police are going to arrest criminals. The court is going to, the judiciary is basically going to say, are they innocent, are they guilty? Sure. The penal system is going to imprison, and the probation system is going to mediate that. When any branch of that breaks down, the whole system collapses. And I just always took it for granted. So in the beginning of the riots in particular, there were not a lot of prosecutions. And I think that's what alienated many of the police, because they were arresting people, and the district attorney, and I think he's changed his tune, we could talk about that, Mike Schmidt, was simply not prosecuting people. And that gave the entire city the feeling of lawlessness, right?
That's a good reason.
And it emboldened people. They just knew that nothing was going to happen to them.
But city council actually took measures to specifically make law enforcement less effective during the riots. For example, banning them from cooperating with federal law enforcement. They actually passed resolutions. Portland police could not cooperate in any way with the federal law enforcement.
And remember, Trump was in office at the time, and Ted Wheeler, him is a leftist.
Yeah.
And the far left also engaged in lawfare. They're very good at that. So they sued the Portland police, accusing them of using excessive force. So then, what's happened is that Portland police are banned from using tear gas and impact munitions.
Right.
So the only tools they have now for a long time now to respond to the riots was batons and pepper spray. And when you're dealing with a mob of hundreds and thousands. Yeah. So then they actually it was very clear they pulled back after a number of months from responding. I don't know if I speculate that that was an official reaction to basically them not having any tools. But then this is why it went on for so long. If you ask me, how do you have riots that go on that long? It's because it was completely, the rioters were able to act with impunity. The
Also,
far left rioters.
Yeah, I was going to say about the far left thing, because that's the other side of the question, right? Because there's one thing, the authorities not cracking down on massive violent riots, right? That's one thing, smashing up innocent people's property and all this sort of stuff. But there's also got to be a motivating force to make people go out and riot in the first place. And it's worth talking about that, isn't it? Like, what is motivating them for 120 days straight to go out and riot?
Well, ostensibly it was for racial justice because of George Floyd, but it was an opportunity for violent anarchists, narcissistic extremists, and communists to have a free-for-all in public. There was a study that was just published in, I think the journal is Current Psychology, and it's a quantitative study looking at personality traits of political extremists. And one, according to the academic authors of this article, they found that narcissistic and violent psychopathy traits are predictors of also having far left extremist views. This is completely unsurprising to any of us who's been covering this. It's nice to see there's at least now some
science
academic research to back that up. But so you had ideologues that were spearheading a lot of the organizing, and you had a lot of riffraff who showed up, including homeless people. These were kind of like these were a lot of the people who arrested, basically the fodder, the people who just showed up, were given the explosives to throw, given the weapons to use, and if they were arrested and on the rare chance prosecuted, the people behind them would never be exposed.
And there'd also be people to like pay their bail and things like that, assuming it came to that. So you can see how, in the case of Portland, the entire system seems to actually be set up to encourage and facilitate the rioters.
You only need one facet of the system to not work. That's all you need for the breakdown of the system.
Because going back to your your assumption that, well, the system will just work, right? The people within it will just do what they're expected to do.
Naive assumption now.
Well, is it naive? Because, I mean, normally the people within an institution work towards the internal goal of the institution. Like,
Correct.
You know, the justice system, people are working to get to what they believe to be a just conclusion. But in the university, they want educated people. There's an internal goal to the institution, and it's not unreasonable or naive to think that the people involved will be working towards that goal.
Okay, so would you want to take that?
Go ahead.
Well, there are many ways to look at it. Here's one way to look at it, is that diversity, equity, and inclusion are universal solvents, and they destroy everything they touch. And one of the consequences is the mission of institutions change, and they change from doing what they're supposed to be doing, arresting criminals, prosecuting criminals, incarcerating criminals, adjudicating, or what have you. It changes to an equity-based system. So, for example, racial sentencing, racial hiring among police. And once the North Star of the institution is lost, the primary mission, it just goes off mission.
Yeah, it gets an external goal.
It has another goal, and both of those goals. I mean, how does one hierarchically prioritize when those goals are in competition? So that's one way to look at it. There are two others, but
I would argue that in 2020 and before that, during the Trump years, that the actions of the violent street thugs, whatever they organized under, was in line actually with the Democrat establishment in places like Oregon and Washington State. Not entirely. I mean, Antifa believe in actually literally overthrowing the state.
Yeah.
However, Antifa and BLM were very useful as sort of street thugs in enforcing violently, basically Democrat orthodoxy around social justice beliefs. Do you disagree with that?
Well, no, I think that's completely true. There's a kind of a sort of river of principles that they're all operating, they're all sailing down, right? They all agree that they want social justice, racial equality, sexual equality, liberation, all that sort of thing.
Let me pick a bone with both things you have said. So yes, I'll give it to you that's primarily found among Democrats, but that's value that's parasitized itself onto traditional democratic institutions. I mean, that's not the value of the old leftists. I mean, I'm just thinking anecdotally about my father or the people in his generation. And if you said, hey, there are these people who are going to be rioting, what do you think should happen to them? You don't know if they have a good reason for rioting or not. It's blue collar Democrat. People, he would say, well, what do you mean? What should happen?
But you're talking about the average Democrat voter. I'm talking about the elected
yes, I'm
Democrat
talking about the
politicians.
average Democrat voter.
Look at city council. Let's just focus on Oregon. Look at who is in city council and what they said. And at the county level, and then at the state level, our senators, our lawmakers at the time.
No, I'm talking about the voter on the street, like this somebody who's been a blue collar Democrat.
So I think I see exactly the issue here, right? Because this seems to be the ideological capture of the elites against the interest of the base, right? Because we have very much the same sort of thing in Britain with the Labour Party, which is honestly, it's almost a carbon copy of what's happening in America with the Democrats. As in the Labour Party would have lower class, working class people who would be considered to be socially conservative. They weren't ideological socialists.
Right.
They just wanted to make sure that their interests were represented because they didn't want to be exploited by big business, by international corporations, by the state itself, by aristocracies, whatever it is. Because, they work hard, they pay their taxes, they expect law and order, they're decent, hardworking people. They aren't woke progressives. Right, woke progressives are very much a new and different phenomenon to what they would call in, say, our father's generation, socialism. Right, it's not the same thing, and this ideology captures the elites. It weaponizes the institutions against these very people. And that's why for Brexit, for example, the North ended up voting for the Conservative Party because the North was socially conservative. And what that means in England is sovereignty. They want to be away from the European Union. Whereas all of the middle classes, the educated middle classes, don't understand why the working classes see this as a vote in their own interests. The vote to keep the power closer to where they are. And this schism has been just unbelievably open here.
So here's the other thing that happened since George Floyd. I think two other factors are operative. One, I think you see a version of the Ferguson effect. And so police officers will not arrest. In fact, I was just in New York City before I came to the island here, and a bunch of transit police were standing around in New York, and I'm trying to think of the best way to say this. I just know no politic way to say this. African Americans were just jumping the turnstile. Sure. I mean, they would just jump in mass, and the transit police were literally right. And I was just watching the transit police talk among themselves and watch them, and I do think that there is a concern, and I've spoken to police officers about this, that they don't want to be perceived as being racist.
Completely.
And I'm not saying that that's right or wrong. I'm not justifying they're not. I'm just saying that this is a phenomenon, and I think you see the large-scale George Floyd effect. Not George Floyd.
Ferguson effect.
Ferguson effect, excuse me.
Well, and officers don't want to be put in a situation where an unpredictable suspect then makes them be the next Derek Chauvin.
Right.
And I mean that's quite an extreme outcome. But even before that, you can see what happened.
No, but it's the threat of that, right?
Yeah, people,
or even much more
threat.
mild, like that New York hospital worker who. These black youths were trying to take away the bike that she had purchased, and then she was and her family were hounded as the racist and targeted by probably thousands of people online through these social media campaigns. And that was an instance where she was a victim of a attempted crime.
And I think that, and I can't speak to how it is here. I just learned today, you said the black population is 3%.
In this country,
And so I think that there is these equity-based initiatives and Americans' mind on equity. Everybody is so hyper-racially conscious right now. Yeah. And I think that bleeds through the system.
But what I was getting at, though, is the sort of traditional blue voters. They're going to be people who view law and order as a process, right? Okay. They view the act of jumping the turnstile as the act itself is criminally punishable, right? And so they will be like, well, I don't really care who does it. That person has to be punished. Whereas the the people in charge now are looking at spreadsheets and are looking at disparate outcomes, and will say, well, the act itself isn't actually very important. What's important is that we have an equality here, or else there is racism and the system itself is corrupt.
Okay, so this is to me one of the most fascinating turns of the last few years that nobody talks about. And that is how arresting rioters, if I say I believe people who riot and destroy whatever they want to destroy, whether for good reason or bad, if you're rioting in a U.S. city, I think you should be arrested.
Sure.
The narrative then becomes you're a conservative or you're a Republican.
Well, there we go.
And that to me is fascinating.
Which I think
That
speaks
is
to the
totally ahistorical.
It's the but it shows the shift to the left and the capture of the ideology. And there's on the right at the moment, there's a big discussion about managerialism and the very nature of it. And if you read James Burnham's The Managerial Revolution, you end up with this kind of idea that actually this was kind of inevitable, right? Because the proliferation of data through society and the strength of the state at the moment, which is totally supported by the left, even when they claim not to support it, it kind of makes it inevitable that the people at the top will say, well, look, we have all of these, like the sort of managerial tools that Hitler would have been envious of, right? like we
have to edit that out.
No,
I'm just
no.
kidding. Go ahead.
You know,
go
but
ahead.
I'm not joking. But it's funny, but it's true, right?
I know.
Hitler or Mussolini, any totalitarian dictator of the 20th century would be like, God, if only I had that level of information, level of being able to monitor people, cameras on every corner. The data that electronically comes in about like what you eat, where you go, it's all on your phone. It's all trapped on the grid. It all comes together. And if you've got this in God knows what kind of spreadsheets, all of this laid out, well, it's inevitable that you'll end up with a kind of managerial philosophy to go with it, because actually you see yourself as like the director of society. So now we need to stop people smoking because too many people are dying of lung cancer. It's like, well, it's not unjust actually. They chose to smoke. They enjoyed their smoking. They got lung cancer. They died.
And those are the social credit, the critics of the social credit.
Exactly. And you end up with this need for a managerial philosophy, and then wokeism comes along and says, well, actually, we've got the perfect managerial philosophy. Yeah. It's ultimately moral. No one is on the side, no one's pro-racism. And so, no one's pro-sexism. No one's pro any of the bad things that we're told that come as a consequence of the sort of natural and organic moving in society that people do, right? And so if you're a manager, you've got a series of spreadsheets where it's uneven distributions. The only explanation you have for those is racism, because, of course, having a different explanation is racist in and of itself.
No, the only explanation is it's racism, it's systemic racism. It's the system.
Yeah, of course.
And then once you get that, then you can change words accordingly.
And if you're in charge of the system,
minoritized,
But if you're in charge of the system, you're like, yeah, great, I can just change the system. And so if part of the system is arresting black people for jumping over turnstiles, you can rationalize any kind of reason why. Well, hang on a second. If we do that, that's going to increase the black people in prison, and that's bad for my columns. So we can't have that. So they have to be let go because they're black.
And there's something about the system of policing in certain neighborhoods that lead to those outcomes.
Absolutely.
Right.
And then when you ask the people on the ground, go to the black communities and say, "Would you like more or less police?" They say more. Every time, almost 90% of them say more. And so
that data is in. We just did a podcast with him, Matt Thornton's The Gift of Violence, and one of the things that he says in that book that I thought was so interesting is that men, one can dislike this fact, but this is a fact. Men have radically disproportionate rates of contact with the police, but no one says the police is anti-male.
Everyone knows that men are more violent.
Right.
It's not
so
wrong
the reason that police are in certain neighborhoods, it's not, and I'm not saying every police officer is.
Every police officer is anti-male.
Right. It's not that they're harboring.
Some of my best friends are men.
It's not that they're harboring an animus against people in those communities. It's that's where more of the crime occurs, and the consequences of pulling out those police is that the crime in those neighborhoods will increase, and the people who are hurt, it's not me. It's not middle-class white guys.
No, it's the black community.
It's the people in those neighborhoods.
Yeah.
Well, we have the national data from the increases across the U.S. in urban areas of homicides following 2020.
Correct.
And that's why now they have to attack the moral legitimacy of the categories themselves. The fact that you think it's wrong to live in a high crime neighborhood is white privilege, white supremacy. This is what they like, timekeeping, all of these things. Like anything that is the notion of an inequality between these groups, that now has to be attacked as a legitimate category of bigotry in and of itself.
So I just had a conversation with our mutual friend, Heather McDonald, and she goes through those statistics, and they are horrifying.
Yeah.
And they're horrifying. And that gets back to an earlier point of this was a light bulb for me, when I asked her, why do you think so many people are callously indifferent to the meritocracy? They're just willing to throw the meritocracy away. And she told me, based upon her most recent book and a little bit from her former book, The Diversity Delusion, that people don't understand the disparity. Those disparities they're not trivial. They're vast, like SAT scores, MCAT scores, any standardized test scores. And so they think that, well, we can do away with certain features of how we've come to merit is the only way to say it. We can do away with that because ultimately you're going to produce an equitable outcome. But what they don't understand is that those disparities are so great that people won't be able to fulfill the functions of their jobs and actually do their duties because they're not qualified for the requisite positions. Does that make sense?
No, totally. And it's one of those things that we were talking about this earlier. This is going to have knock-on effects in services. Things are just going to start failing, and there won't be the people around who can explain why they're failing. That's not going to be good.
Yeah. Did you used to have those commercials when somebody popped an egg in a pan and said, "Your brain on drugs"?
Yeah.
Oh, you had those over
Well,
here.
I'm aware we had something like it.
Oh, okay.
I'm aware of those.
I would argue it's like your brain on equity, right? Once your brain is on equity, your perceptual filter, the lens through which you make ethical and moral judgments, just becomes completely skewed. Like it becomes so utterly divorced from reality that you start making choices that when you don't have the consequences of reality and you're viewing things through an ideological filter, you become further and further removed from the truth. And so if you do that long enough, planes are just going to fall out of the air.
Yeah. Yeah. The pilots won't even know why they're bad pilots.
Yeah, people will not be able to fulfill their duty, and institutions will not be able to fulfill their missions because something other than making good beer, for example, is...
And then if it comes to questions of rights and like positive right entitlements, well, if the institutions can't fulfill those positive rights, and who wins?
If I may have just one more second. So in a normal, sane universe, the corrective for this would be a discussion. I would say conversation, but if you want to say debate, you have let the crucible of ideas go, that's fine too. I'm fine. But that would be the normal way that you would figure out, well, should we have an equity-based policy? What kind of public policy should we be institutionalizing, or at least instituting? But the people who are advocating for the policies themselves believe that there's something in the tools, the traditional tools that we've used to figure out what policies to enact that are themselves racist.
Yeah.
So you can't use a racist tool to achieve an anti-racist or non-racist outcome. So you have to switch to another tool set like lived experience.
Yeah, which is why they want to get rid of the police. The police themselves, the very notion of law and order, becomes a tool of white supremacy
and capitalism, and that's the other thing on their target. So the normal ways to figure out problems, they've removed the tool set from us,
and they don't have any replacements either.
Well, other than lived experience. But the question is, how do you, if someone says something is in their lived experience, and someone else says who has some identity level characteristic, identity characteristic says, well, that's not in my lived experience. There's no way to figure out if that's true.
But that's correct. But what I mean is, for any problem that comes up, if you've got a constructive solution, then okay, fair enough. Maybe we can abandon the traditional method of doing it. But if you don't have a constructive method, I mean, we defund the police, crime goes through the roof. But did you want more crime?
Yeah,
now we've got to attack the very notion of it being crime.
Yeah, there's one other problem, and I hate to throw the conversation in a meta level, but the only way you could know that at all is to use the tools to evaluate the very tools. So it would be like someone saying, well, I have a crystal ball here, and this crystal ball is better than the scientific method. Well, the only way you could assess the accuracy of the crystal ball and its efficacy is to use the scientific method to see if it did what it said it could do. And the same thing is true with the tools. You just can't get away from the fact that dialogue, discourse, scientific adequacies, the scientific method, epistemic adequacy. You just cannot get around the fact that these are the tools that we have to rely upon to construct societies. Now, you can say, well, we can construct societies, but we need to have a different set of values. But even if you say that, you still need the tools to figure out if those are the values that you should enact.
I mean, and the only alternative then is to step fully into the world of faith. And so you're fully,
There's one other alternative. You just pick up a gun and start shooting people.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But even then, it's the world of faith that's going to win that, because they're going to be the ones who can rally the largest force, right? It's going to be people who, someone who will say there's some sort of prophet, you know, here's a divine revelation, God is telling me this. When it moves enough hearts through whatever theological motivation it has, then you get the crusade, you know. But it's what we're staring down the barrel of is genuinely the end of liberal democracy, and I think that's actually what they wanted.
Yes, that's explicitly their goal.
That's why they call it this. That's why Wesleyan calls it the successor ideology, the successor liberalism.
It's not bloody good, is it? It's happening in the most affluent places in America, right?
Yeah, and even worse, it's being exported to you and to the rest of the Anglosphere and the rest of the world.
I mean, it's. There's something about it that I genuinely find repugnant, is the assumption of kind of moral infallibility.
Yes.
It really annoys me in the individual, though.
Excellent.
Right? Yeah. I really hate this. It's like the individual can't really do anything wrong. It's the Rousseauian view that society made them evil. It's like, I don't care. You know, if society made them evil, then we've at least agreed that they're evil. I'm actually very old English in my morality. Evil things should be punished very harshly, actually. So, you know, flog them. That's
but they wouldn't even admit that person is evil.
Yeah. They would say I'm a victim.
Yeah, they're a victim, but they're not just a victim. They're a victim of the system.
Yeah.
Yes, that was the narrative from the trans activists after the Nashville trans mass shooting. They held a direct action protest at the Tennessee State Capitol. Do you remember the video where they held up 7 fingers?
Yeah, and I'm thinking about the Day of Vengeance.
Sorry, no, what was the video where they held up 7? I missed that.
So days after the mass shooting, so there were 6 victims, 3 children and 3 staff of the school. And then the shooter was also killed by police.
Sorry,
So there's 6 victims. Yeah. The trans activists held up a moment of silence, and they held up 7 fingers
so
for
the
victims.
Shooter was one of the victims.
Yes. So the trans activists viewed the shooter, the killer, the mass murderer, as a victim. In some of the statements they put out on social media, but some of the trans activist groups also alluded to this, that Audrey was, well, they didn't use that name, but
Aiden, wasn't it?
Was a victim of transphobic society.
Okay, so let's just take a step back. Every single thing he said, if you're a sane person and you were listening to that, you are can I swear?
No.
You are completely freaked out by that. And a consequence of being freaked out by that is, one of them is, I cannot live with these people.
Yeah, absolutely.
And a consequence of that, if enough people start saying that, they think we need a national divorce.
Yeah.
That's how insane this is.
Yeah. And that's why you see the Republicans talking about this all the time. And I'm like, really, you're going to concede half your country to these maniacs, are you?
Yeah.
And the Republicans seem to be like, well, yeah, I just want them away from it. It's like, I hate to say it, but you guys are going to have to get into crusading mode, right? You need to go and conquer these areas, drive these lunatics out, and make sure they never hold public office again. You know, get a ground game, get your guys elected. It's not impossible. It can happen. That's what they're doing to you. You've got to go and do it back. But for some reason, the Republicans are just...
institutional capture, large scale institutional capture.
It's not just that. It's not just that. There's some kind of fear in the conservative, not necessarily there's this sort of the Christian nationalists, right, who want to do that.
Yeah.
But for some reason, the Republicans who are reasonable people are actually kind of afraid of just legislating against the left. And it's like, no, Ron DeSantis is a great example who's actually willing to do it. Right? Mm-hmm. Just go and do it. Just ban. You don't get to do this. You know, we're in charge. We're legitimately in charge. You don't get to do it. But for some reason, conservatives in this country in particular, but it's still across large amounts of America, I think, are just kind of afraid of declaring war. And it's like, no, these people, if you can't tell, have declared war on you. If this isn't a war.
Well, the American right has this, and also the British conservative tradition, has this view of respecting the autonomy and rights of the citizen and the individual. And so I think
Sounds quaint, doesn't it, when you say it like that?
let's just say the GOP, the political philosophy really is about, in many ways, kind of handicapping themselves, kneecapping themselves. Because the other side, the radicals on the left, they don't have any principles that
Of which I would include people like Joe Biden, right? Well, I would include Joe Biden as a radical on the left.
Why?
Because of the things he does. I mean, the first day in office, he literally just sat down and was like, I hate Trump. I'm going to undo everything that he did, whether it was a good idea or not. Like canceling the Keystone XL pipeline. What are you doing? There are loads of like gender reforms and stuff like this. He just undoes all of this stuff.
I don't think it's so much Biden as more so the DNC has really been captured by the radicals in its party.
But I'm not prepared to let him off the hook, right? Because he is the president.
Yes.
Ostensibly, he should be in charge, right? So the institution of Biden then, shall we say, the people who are propping, because obviously, he's 80 years old. He probably goes to sleep at about 3 p.m. He's not the guy who's really in charge. But the institution that Joe Biden represents, that's the radical left to me. That's an institution at war with the rest of the country. Like,
I'm always hesitant to get involved in political discussions because I don't want people to think that free speech and open inquiry and no puberty blockers for children, these are right-left issues. So I'm always hesitant to put a political opinion on the table because I don't want it to seem like I hold the positions I hold because I'm on the right or left. I hold them because they're evidence-based,
sure,
civilizational based. Go ahead.
But let's just say on the issue that the being against the medical transitioning of minors, that is at least in the U.S. a partisan position of the right.
I don't be in favor as a partisan position.
I don't think it should be.
I agree with that. It's not in the UK. It's different. I think here it's been really removed from partisan politics.
Okay.
But in the US, it's
okay. And if you watch, for example, this is why I disagreed with. I agree with Andy. I don't think it's Biden. If you watch the second one of the presidential debates with Trump, I think it was the second one. Biden didn't even know the difference between equity and equality.
Yeah, no. I'm not.
Bernie Sanders, and it's on. I looked it up. It's on Bernie Sanders' page of his mission, his promises or planks or something. And I invite your readers to look it up. He was on Real Time with Bill Maher. He didn't even know what equity was.
Yeah, and I'm not saying
so
that
they don't even know what it is that they're doing.
Sure, and I agree. I'm not saying that they are the captains of the ship, as it were. But as political institutions, and Biden and Bernie Sanders, they've got a whole cohort of people, millions of activists, an entire structure with them at the top. I mean, if they're incompetent, well, that's just their problem, right? Because that's what they represent and that's what they're leading.
Okay, so all right, so let me just throw something out, not to complicate this, but Kamala Harris would be an example.
No, she's totally incompetent.
She has put out videos on equity that actually show you what equity is. That's equity.
Yeah.
You can disagree with it, but that is it, and I do profoundly disagree with it.
Yeah. But the point is, I don't think it's inaccurate to describe this movement as being at war with non-equity movement, right? So anything they perceive to be outside of not conforming to the principles of equity, I think they would ruthlessly destroy it if given the power. If they were given absolute power, there wouldn't be a Republican Party. It'd be gone. It'd be banned for being racist and white supremacist.
Yeah, probably the Republicans would say the same thing, though, right?
Say that again.
I think many of the Republicans would say the same thing. Everybody thinks that they're this is an age. The age in which we live. It's not just that people who disagree with you. It's that they're existential threats.
Yeah.
Both Republicans and Democrats, and I don't even mean on the extreme. They believe that they have some kind of ideological enemy and that people are existential threats.
But I don't think this is something that is intrinsic to the Republicans. I think if this has come about, this is a new thing, and it's because of a reaction to watching the left. Because like Andrew was saying, the Republicans seem to be very milquetoast to me and very like, well, we're fellow Americans. We've got, and then this is a conservative position. It's a traditionally sentimental position.
There's always a fear of growing the state too big.
Yeah. But also not stigmatizing what should be, in this country, we call them the loyal opposition, right? Sure, we oppose each other, but we're all in the same boat and therefore we're all working together, really. And so we're all, we've just got different opinions, right? But we're all fellow countrymen. And that 20 years ago, the sort of like, the soft Republicans thought that. But you are seeing a hard streak coming out in the Republican fringe now, which is like, no. The left has declared war on us and it's been persecuting us for about the last decade.
Yeah.
And actually, it's about time we start fighting back. Because I think it's fair.
In the States, we call people who disagree with many of those positions rhinos, Republicans in name only. And so, there is no homogenous, there is a homogenous block of Republicans, but there's incredible diversity within those blocks.
Yeah.
And there are kind of quote unquote litmus test issues like abortion and less so death penalty and border security. But this is not a homogenous ideological block of people.
No. And it's a broad tent, right? But the Democrats have become an increasingly narrow tent.
See, that's the case. That's exactly right.
And the increasingly narrow tent is focusing around that faction that seems to be just waging a war.
Yeah.
By covert or overt means.
Yeah, and if you look at what is the object of their war, what's informing their beliefs, they're almost all in the orbit of critical social justice ideology. Yeah. Almost everything has some identity level salience. It's really like. That's why I said before I wrote my first book. It's like Gad Saad talks about this in The Parasitic Mind. It's been parasitized. It's like a parasite on a traditional belief that's causing it to run into crazy town. And I do think you're right that many of the Republicans have reacted against that craziness in the same way when I said that when Andy very clearly articulated that point of view, some people will hear that and they'll just think that this is the most deranged thing I've ever heard. I want nothing to do with this.
I think that there are large factions of Democrat leadership that are probably quite comfortable creating essentially a one-party state. Because look at, the reaction to the 6th of January, treating that as an example, as actually being representative of the entire GOP, that the GOP is such a danger. And this is their main talking point. Trump supporters, and they expanded that to just any U.S. Republican voters, such a danger to our democracy that they must really kind of be stopped by any means necessary using full force of the law. And they did that and that messaging was very effective, and it's been repeated endlessly. But look at the spurious investigations into President Trump also to delegitimize him and try to remove him from office or try to prevent him from running again. So I am a conservative. I'm not that much of a partisan figure, really. I don't really care too much about party politics, but I am really disturbed by how comfortable Democrat institutions are at saying essentially, their reactions to elections is always basically that if our side doesn't win, democracy ends. Yeah. That's their messaging.
Yeah, but the Republicans also have their own kind of craziness, the stolen elections. And I think.
Is that crazy?
I think, I do. I do think every
Democrats the kind of people who wouldn't cheat?
No, I do think that this. Look, I'm going to give you. I'm going to give you what we're looking for. The left is largely ideologically captured by a completely deranged ideology. But that doesn't mean that the Republicans don't have their institutionalized foibles, would be the most politic way to say it.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
And so I think that there's a danger in seeing, well, because these people are complete lunatics, then the people fighting the complete lunatics must have some kind of moral, or maybe they do have moral clarity, but they must they're not subject to
they have their own
themselves.
Excesses, right? And I agree. Yeah. And actually, one thing that I've noticed is that there's a more sort of articulate right that's coming to the fore now.
Like DeSantis, you say?
Yeah, no. DeSantis is an effective man legislating in office, but actually he's not a brilliant communicator.
Vivek Ramaswamy, is that who you're going to say?
I'm not familiar with him.
Who are you going to say? Who are you thinking of?
There are lots of people. Douglas Murray is a good example, but obviously he's kind of an international figure. Yeah. But this kind of there's kind of an articulate intellectual right that's starting to appear that's beginning to actually explain. No. Look, there are things about being a conservative that are intellectually and morally valid, and we can explain why that is in concrete terms, right? Because a lot of the time, Donald Trump is a great example where he will do conservative and patriotic things I know he doesn't understand why he does them. Right, he can't give you like a Burkean reason or anything like that, but he does the right thing, and it turns out in the right way.
Okay, you do get that. You do get that from the old leftists. You don't get that from. I mean, you used to get that from who's the guy who leaned right on his chair, William F. Buckley.
Yeah,
you do get so.
But I don't know if I'd call him a conservative. I would call him a Republican. And Republicans, in my opinion, are not conservatives; they're classical liberals. And this is one of the problems with Americans is actually the entire thing's an ideological project. And I say this because I'm an Englishman and I'm not part of an ideological project. So I actually have a different frame of reference. And when I say conservative, I mean Scrutonian types, right? Who will give you a properly like a deep sentimental view of what a conservative nation actually is, and they're finally finding a voice, because actually these things becoming really important, like the feelings of belonging. Why are you here? Why are you where you are? Who are the people around you? Do you love any of them? Do you love the place in which you live? And you can't say that about Portland. Like, they clearly don't love the place in which they live, and that's awful.
I don't know anybody who does. Do you know a single person who doesn't want to leave?
I mean, you see, whenever there are these reports about public safety issues in Portland, you get those leftists who say, well, our community is great, and they list out all the other things about why they think Portland is wonderful. So at least on social media, you see that.
I mean, I would. They will say that, but they'll probably appeal to the fact that Portland is diverse and progressive, right?
Portland is one of the least diverse places in the United States.
I know. But the sort of leading figures of the sort of articulate conservative movement, I'd say a great example is Tucker Carlson, right? He is able to actually articulate like authentically conservative, pre-political concerns in a very just straightforward, frank way that is not in any way bigoted. It is, but genuinely captures the real emotions that people feel. That's the sort of, that's the kind
You're
of
saying he's like a conservative populist?
No, I'm saying no, because
he's not a Scruton figure. I mean, he's not a Douglas Murray figure.
Yeah,
how so?
He's definitely got Scrutonian instincts in the way he views the world. He views Americans as fellow countrymen, right? They're not just interchangeable citizens.
Yeah.
These aren't he views it more mythologically and aesthetically. These are named individuals with lives, with connections, with an authentic claim to these things.
Yeah, I can't speak to that. I know I've been on Tucker, you've been on Tucker, but I can't speak to that.
I've watched a lot of his shows.
Oh, have you?
Right?
Okay.
He was the only thing on Fox News I watched, right? Because, everyone else is just kind of a boilerplate Republican. But you can tell that Tucker comes from a richer tradition than that. And he speaks in words that have got more connotations, right? Whereas you get someone like Sean Hannity, they'll use very thin Republican language.
Yeah, he's a zero. Frankly.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I'm not a fan of really any of them. But you could tell with Tucker, he was thinking in a more romantic way about what it was to be a human being. And this is the sort of deep, rich language that conservatives should be using. And this is starting to actually emerge. And I think, honestly, that's the reason that he got kicked off Fox News, because he was prepared to say things in a particular way that actually kind of invalidated not just the left, it kind of invalidated the GOP. And just before he got kicked off, you saw he was giving a speech. He was like, I'm not part of the GOP.
I saw that.
And because they are essentially the same sort of rationalistic social contract theory construction as the left. They're basically arguing in the same territory. And Tucker's like, I want to be more human, right? I want more human relations, more human contact, more human concerns, rather than ideological concerns. And that's all the GOP and the left really have. And so it's something new is emerging. And this is what I was talking about when we were having a chat before, this kind of sentimental view of the world. And I'm genuinely quite excited about it, because if nothing else, we can see that what the left has been offering doesn't work. It doesn't provide meaning. It doesn't provide belonging.
When you say the left, what are you talking about?
Well, the discourse around rights and entitlements, right?
Well, the left has historically been right about a lot of things. They've been right about civil rights. They've been right about gay rights. They've been right about. They've been on. They actually have been on the right side of history. More frequently. I think when we talk about the left, it's careful to mean the left right now is infected and it's sick.
Just to stop that, it might be too soon to tell, right? That's the problem. Obviously, nobody should be persecuted, right? Obviously, nobody should be persecuted. I don't think I've ever been accused of being a homophobe, right? But we
Dude,
don't
you're
know.
clearly not a homophobe.
But we don't know.
You
where-
gave Andy a huge hug when you
Of
came.
course.
He's sitting. You're clearly
you-
not a homophobe.
Yeah, but you got to understand. To me, Andy is like a figure in the Iliad, right? Andy is like, Achilles, Patroclus or Diomedes or someone. He's a named individual. He exists in a firmament, and he will always be Andy No, and he's irreplaceable. He will always be Andy No.
You
and
making
he will
me want to give him a big hug right now.
But this is how I feel about everyone that I know, right? There's no one's a class to me. Everyone is a mythological thing, right? And there's a great story being played out, and I'm the protagonist in my story, but you're the protagonist in yours. You're the protagonist in yours. And when you weave all of these things together, then you have the sort of genuinely conservative view, the aesthetic view, the mythological view that Tucker Carlson is trying to appeal to and trying to articulate.
Okay,
right?
so I can't speak to the. Go ahead.
But what I'm saying is, so obviously I don't want anyone persecuted, but like to say, well, we're on the right side of history with homosexuality, it's like, it depends by which method you judge. If you're judging by questions of liberation and rights and entitlements, sure. But if your questions are ones of human suffering,
I can.
then actually no, right? Because gay people die 20 years earlier on average than straight people. Gay people suffer from far more STDs than straight people. Have we really, if we're talking in terms of human suffering? Now, that's not every single gay person, and I'm not suggesting that anything should be done to gay people or something like that, but the problem is we have a monomaniacal view of how to address this, and actually there are loads of other ways of analyzing the situation. Like,
what's the this in that sentence?
well, the whether we have liberated gay people from oppression, right? Sure, but are they happy? Do they have friends? Do they have families? Do they have close relationships?
I think.
Are they healthy?
Actually, let's ask Andy.
Well, sure, and Andy's obviously
Because
But Andy's a conservative person, right? I imagine that Andy lives a conservative life as a conservative, right? But that's not most gay people. And I think that actually if you were to look at, say, depression rates in the gay community, I bet you find they're way higher than in other communities, like the straight community, right? And so it, like, again, through the doctrine of rights and liberation, sure, we're on the right side of history, but from the doctrine of, are they happy people?
Okay, but go ahead.
So are you saying that you think that on average, gay people in society would be happier if they were closeted?
No.
I don't mean to straw man, but I'm trying to just simplify.
No. What I'm saying is I don't think that the people in the past had the right way of dealing with gay people, obviously, right? And I think that the Enlightenment has, and it's very justified in its own time to say, look, oppressing people isn't good, is it? Right, obviously. And you can see why, given the sort of post-feudal societies they came out of, that the concerns of the social contract theorists were all, like me, Rousseau, man's born free and ever is in chains. Well, what are the chains? The chains are the ranks of society, right? And these were very thick, very heavy. And I can see totally why in that time and place, it seemed this is justified to break these bonds. But actually, if your doctrine is predicated on the idea of breaking bonds, then all you can do is break until suddenly there are no bonds left. And then you realize actually human beings can be oppressed by those bonds, but also they need those bonds to exist.
You're talking about the logical conclusion of
the
basically this philosophy.
Yeah. And we're arriving at it. We've got, and it's not just gay people, like Zoomers. Zoomers are like half of them are sexless. In their mid-20s, never had sex. I'm thinking, my God, all I did when I was in my mid-20s is chase sex, right? I was, constantly trying to get women. I'm sure you were like in your youth, because we're of the same generation. But it's a totally different world. They're most of them only have like one or two good friends, if that. Like a lot of them feel genuinely lonely. They don't feel like they belong anywhere. But they've got all the rights and all the freedom in the world, right? And so from the doctrine of rights and freedoms, okay, great, they've got everything they want, and yet they're miserable.
Okay, go ahead.
Just to add, I think that the craziness we're seeing right now in the culture wars around the trans ideology is a complete logical conclusion of the arguments that were mainstreamed for, well, gay rights or same-sex marriage, actually, because a lot of the messaging and how it was simplified to the mainstream was essentially that men and women are interchangeable and that love is love. You apply that just a bit further, then it's like, well, what difference does it really make if an individual identifies as man, woman, neither, and switches back and forth anyways? It is kind of the same. It's on the same track. And I think that is, as a gay person, I'm very thankful and indebted to the gay rights activists of prior generations who have worked so hard to make the lives of people like myself safe and having our rights protected in equality under the law, etc. But I do think that there were safeguards that should have been put in place in sort of some of these beliefs that just weren't. And nobody thought about where it would be taken in.
And there's no reason they should
5,
have
10,
done
15
either,
years.
right? Because they're operating. Say you're gay in the 1950s. Yeah, a gay liberation movement is a totally justifiable thing, right? But we've got to the point now where, I mean, the excesses of the gay community are on the streets, right? And during pride marches, and they're not very wholesome or respectable. And so there must be some kind of way of saying, look, maybe we don't want to persecute gay people, but also maybe we could have a measure of respectability where gay people actually feel like they've got an obligation to wider society, right? Rather than standing there, no, my right is to walk down the street naked, covered in dildos, throwing fake spunk out everywhere. Well, maybe it is your right. But I don't want to see that. And why should I have to see that? You're showing me no respect. There's no deference to the wider society at all. And that's not really, I think, what the gay people in the 1950s were arguing for, right? And so there must be, and also another thing is like the oppression of gays seems to itself have been an ideological stance, right? It seems to have come from a deeply Christian ideological position. Well, I'm not a Christian, right? But
Which is, by the way, primarily Republican position. At least it was 30,
Sure.
up until very, very recently.
But there are also other interpretations of Christianity that don't necessarily hate the sin, but love the sinner, right? So it's not, the gay people need to be hurt or they get suppressed or whatever. They need to be helped maybe, talk to or whatever. But like,
I think there's a conflation of issues here between policies that Republicans have enacted, and this is in my lifetime. I mean, we're not talking like 100 years ago. I'm 56, and so there is a fundamental difference. And the discussion started when I said. And I hate the term right side of history because it's been used almost exclusively with trans issues and as an accusation. But the right side of history, you can actually, to a certain extent, figure that out when it's 20, 30 years, 40 years beyond a particular point, whereas the trans ideology is still playing itself out. I do think that traditionally Democrats have been on the right side of history with, for example, what I started saying with gay rights or.
I'm against this.
What is this?
Fundamentally, the very concept of the right side of history, I don't believe it. I don't believe in weak history.
Because you think it's cyclical.
I do believe it's cyclical, yeah.
Okay, well, then there would be no right side of history.
No.
But it is panned out right now that the umbrella of rights has extended to minorities, homosexuals. Now even it's being extended to animals to a certain extent. And I think that those extensions were good. And the extension of that umbrella of rights was primarily on the part of U.S. Democrats.
Sure, but society's falling apart.
You'll get no argument from me about that. You're saying that that's a natural consequence of the extension of those rights.
It's a natural consequence of the excessive focus on rights and zero focus on duties. So, like, for example, I don't think there's any...
I'm sorry, I have to clarify this.
Go ahead.
And you're saying that then the Democrats have focused on rights and not focused on duties.
Can you even imagine a Democrat saying the word duty?
No.
No, I rest my case. But I would think that we have
let me say contemporary
Sure.
Democrats.
I mean, like
FDR or something.
Sure, he would. Yeah.
I mean, JFK.
Yeah. But yeah, in the last 30 years, right? You can't really imagine it, right? But like I think it's totally fair for a conservative to say, look, I think that people should be treated fairly and with compassion. Right, I think a lot of conservatives would completely agree with that.
That was George Bush's compassionate conservative. That was his brand, his moniker. Yeah.
Sure. And so if the left didn't exist and a conservative came up to another conservative and said, look, I don't think we should be persecuting Andy Ngo because of his sexuality. I don't think he can change that. And Andy has behaved in a completely respectable way. Then they'd say, well, yeah, it's probably not nice to persecute him. It's probably not right.
Yeah.
You would have to have an ideological position, say, well, God says.
Yeah, I'll just say that I have a small This is, I just have to get this out. I hear that argument all the time and I never get it. Like, I never understand this is his sexuality, this is her sexuality, they can't change it. But even if they could change it, even if somebody could choose who they want to sleep with, who cares? It's like literally nobody's business.
Well, yes, but I mean, I don't know if we haven't really got time to get into the much wider conversation of that, because then that logic applies to other people and groups who I think actually are justly suppressed, right?
I'm not.
Well, there's currently.
Are you going to the minor attracted persons thing?
Well, that's exactly what I'm going. Because these people say, "Well, look, I can't change my sexuality either." So, well, that's too bad.
Right.
That's bad. You know.
Well, but the difference in that is there's an empirical, demonstrable harm there.
Oh, I agree.
Whereas if two guys, Andrew Sullivan.
Yeah, I know. I totally agree with you. But the argument still holds up, right? And so they will make that argument, and the person who's arguing from the doctrine of rights is kind of stuck there, right? So
no, you're right. So there can be no rights without duties.
Exactly.
As is famously said. And I do think that Democrats have failed wholesale in terms of duties, unless they've bastardized the concept so much to make certain moral impulses, to classify moral impulses as duties. But I agree with that.
Yeah. And so we're going to have to bring this to a close. But like, this is what I mean when I say that if we have a different way of conceiving of the world, like emotionally, I would be concerned if anyone was like, right, we're going to persecute Andy. Right? It doesn't matter the reason, really. I don't want to see a friend of mine persecuted. So emotionally, I would be concerned about that, not in an abstract way of, well, a threat to justice somewhere, anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Yeah. It's very abstract. No. I personally am invested in my friend. This is
and I think that impulse and the idea that you want to discharge the good, if you will, that impulse is operative in the kernel of all wokeness. The problem is that it goes from the kernel of wokeness to protect homosexuals to crazy town, right? And with no clear lines of demarcation.
I think it's the concept of liberty. It's the liberation of it.
Yeah, and I'll add one more thing to that. Something that I think is extremely important, at least in my intellectual life and the work I do, is it's cognitive liberty. Like if somebody hates, my kids are gay. If someone hates my kids for who they are, they hate my kids for who they are, right? And so the solution to that, or if someone hates Andy for who he is not to tell people who they can hate or who they can love. It's you can't act upon that, right? We have to make laws that endanger people or physical violence against someone. But there's a kind of concept creep now that I find really disturbing, and that we have people who are convinced that they have the right answers to moral questions, and they want to tell other people not just how to live, but how to think. And I think that there's something particularly pernicious to our democracy when those people take over our institutions.
I agree.
Which they have.
Which is why we're the ones like on the fringes rather than having these conversations on television.
And it's also, by the way, why the podcast scene, in my opinion at least, is so popular and it's proliferated so widely. And your views are incredible on this, is because I think people can't speak. People feel, and I think they feel this correctly, that they can't speak openly and honestly in university settings. And so one of the places they go is they go to people like you, right? They want to hear what you have to say about things.
People like you too as well. I mean, But anyway, I think we're going to have to leave it there because you've got other engagements, unfortunately. But Andy and Peter, man, thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for joining me. This has been an amazing conversation. I hope you guys have enjoyed it. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.